Good evening, welcome. It's now 6 o'clock. I'm handing over to Dr. Sharon Harbour. Thank you. Dr. Harbour, over to you. Welcome.
Good evening, Renier. For some reason, I'm just struggling with my video. 1 second, please.
Dr. Harbour, you can just give me a shout when you're ready. Thank you.
Will do. I'm just using another device quickly.
Dr. Harbour, would you like me to hand it over to Dr. Muhali and then she can take it from here?
Can you see me now? Hi, colleagues. Can you see me?
Yeah, we can see now. Thank you.
Can you hear me clearly?
We can hear you as well. Thank you.
A warm welcome, colleagues. I apologize for that technical delay. Good evening, colleagues. My name is Dr. Sharon Harbour. I serve as a director of the South African Medical Association, and I'm also the proud chairperson of the South African Women's Wing. On behalf of the South African Medical Association, a warm welcome to tonight's webinar. Tonight, we seek to unpack gender-based violence in the medical profession. Colleagues, this is not an easy issue to talk about. This issue is not only a reflection of the broader societal challenges we face, but also a critical concern that impacts the well-being of our members, career progression, and mental health of many dedicated healthcare professionals. In South Africa, the prevalence of gender-based violence is alarmingly high, and the medical fraternity is not immune. And it manifests itself in various forms. So this includes sexual harassment, discrimination, bullying, and even violence. And these actions are often perpetuated in environments that are said to be safe and supportive. And in fact, these undermine the foundational principles of respect, of dignity, and equality that the medical profession seeks to uphold. These incidents not only hinder the ability of both female and male healthcare workers to perform their duties effectively, but they also contribute to an environment of fear and of silence. And we need to recognize that this is not just an individual issue, but it's a systemic one. It is one that is partially rooted in deep-seated gender biases, power imbalances, and cultural norms that perpetuate inequality in our society. I believe that addressing these issues involves both policy changes, education, and support systems, but also a commitment by everyone involved to cultural transformation within the healthcare sector. Without any further ado, I would like to welcome our panelists for this evening. First of all, I'm really excited about this one. We have Professor Noza Dlova. She's the head of dermatology, and she's a full professor and the dean of the School of Clinical Medicine at UKZN. She has many accolades and leadership. She has many accolades and leadership awards behind her name, and is the first African who is the medical dean of UKZN, and it's been running for 73 years. Welcome, Prof. Dlova. Next up, we have Dr. Mpengwa Tsaugelo Manyoni. She is a dedicated medical doctor who also holds an MBA in healthcare leadership. And I'm proud to say that she's one of the other women who champion the rights of women in healthcare by serving on the South African Women's Wing Committee. Welcome, Dr. Manyoni. And lastly, we have a gentleman with us in the house. He goes by the name of Mr. Reginald Masemola. He is an admitted attorney, and currently serves as medical legal advisor at the South African Medical Association. He did his articles at McRoberts Attorneys in Pretoria, where he was exposed to various fields of law that contributed to his foundation in the fraternity. And we're really excited to be able to have a legal opinion, but also not just a female view, but a male view to our discussions this evening. Without any further ado, colleagues, sit back, relax, engage with us. What will happen is we have some questions prepared for our panelists, so they'll answer a few of these questions. And then in the last 20 minutes of our session, we'll give everyone an opportunity to enter their own questions in the chat, and we'll address these. So welcome, panelists, and thank you so much for taking your time to engage in this important topic. My first question, just to open us off, will be to Dr. Manyoni. I think one of the biggest surprises for me in the healthcare field is to say that I experienced my own issues with, let's say, sexual harassment in the workplace. But sadly, professors even before me have also experienced the same. And it's quite alarming that over, let's say, 30, 40, 50 years, issues that women in medicine were experiencing then are still the same issues that I and my own juniors are experiencing now. So, Dr. Manyoni, what has been your own experience of gender-based violence within the workplace?
Thank you, Sharon. I think I'll just start off by briefly defining what GBV is. So we know it is the when there's unequal power between the two main genders that we ascribe to, and it is also the physical, verbal, sexual, psychological abuse, or even threats to such abuses, and can also be an educational or an economic deprivation. So me being a clinician, I think my experience of GBV was mostly in the form of sexual harassment. And, retrospectively looking at it, I think there's been many instances where it has been trivialized within our institutions, where it's a joke. I tell a friend, this certain person said such and such, and they'll share their experience of a similar incident. So retrospectively, I think we have trivialized sexual harassment, and I think it's actually quite common and quite sad that even in my generation and even in the former generations, we still have, that abuse of power that we see between seniors and juniors. And I can only imagine what medical students have to go through now, even today. So, yeah.
Thank you. And I think perhaps what makes it particularly difficult at times is that the medical fraternity is so small, right? So if you are a registrar in pediatrics, if it is your supervisor that is assaulting you, how do you get sign off? Who teaches you? Where do you go? And it has such a big impact on how your career progresses, how comfortable you are in that field or in what you do. And it can be detrimental. Thank you so much for that. But as a leader in healthcare, Prof. Lova, what do you think the role of the workplace is in terms of perpetuating or mitigating this culture of gender-based violence? And what has been your experience, Prof? Sorry, Prof, I think you're muted.
I'm not actually. I'm not muted.
Oh, I can hear you now. Thank you.
Maybe it's our tech person. Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Perfectly.
Yeah. Okay. So just a point of correction. I'm the previous ex-dean. I stepped down end of March. So I'm back to my department now. Yeah, but to answer your question, I think, as leaders, we need to maintain the highest standards of ethical conduct and make sure that the actions and, we uphold the actions and behaviors that actually speak to the principles of integrity, respect, and accountability when it comes to sexual harassment and gender-based violence. And we also need to, support awareness and compliance with the relevant university policies and procedures, and make sure that there are staff agreements in terms of these policies. So in my personal experience, really as a dean, or maybe as a head of department as well, yes, I have experienced, staff members reporting sexual harassment. It's been very difficult because sometimes you have to hear both sides of the story, obviously. And then sometimes certain initiatives or moves may be misinterpreted as sexual harassment, and yet they are not. So I think we have to be really open-minded when it comes to this, because we also don't want to victimize the opposite gender who has been accused. So in my experience, where a scenario like that occurs, I found that actually there was nothing wrong with the male doctor who was accused of sexual harassment, but the problem was with the personality issue with the actual doctor who was reporting that. So that's my personal experience, but otherwise I haven't had any other, evidence to show sexual harassment in the tenure that I've been as a leader.
Thank you, Prof. And do you feel that maybe the policies that you have in place within your department are helpful in protecting the individuals in that department from sexual harassment?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the initiatives that we spoke about 2 years or 3 years ago was we spoke about, academic bullying, which is something similar, what we're talking about, but this one is more gender directed. So we've got posters all over because that was more prevalent than sexual harassment and gender-based violence within the medical fraternity. So we sort of focused on that. And as I say, gender-based violence is not something that I've personally, experienced in terms of my leadership. However, if myself and other leaders, there is an increase in the report of that, I think it's something that would have to take action as much as we have in terms of the academic bullying, because that was much more prevalent than this aspect.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. I think it's time to hear from you, Mr. Reginald. What are the differences as far as, the legal definitions are concerned between, let's say, things like sexual harassment, sexual assault, rape? I think we'll get back to maybe workplace bullying in a bit.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here. I would like to actually take the conversation just a little bit backwards, if you will. When we look at gender-based violence, this is the big umbrella, in which many other acts fall in. Particularly, the big word that we see is harassment. There is a beautiful piece of document, called the Code of Good Practice on the Prevention and Elimination of Harassment in the Workplace. It's quite a very long piece of document. So this document was sent out by the Department of Labor. It was issued under the Department of Employment and Labor. I just want to give a little bit of background behind it, just so that if people want to read up on it just a little bit more. This would be Gazette number 11409. So this was issued on the 18th of March 2022. So what this does is that it defines harassment in the broader sense. And I'd just like to just maybe take us through that definition. It's quite a bit of a lengthy one, but just allow me to just maybe unpack it as we go along and just tie in all the various elements that we will be talking about, just to give a little bit of perspective. You know, it defines harassment as the unwanted conduct which impairs the dignity of one. You know, so I would underline the word dignity here. It also says that it is one which creates a hostile, intimidating work environment for one or more employees, or is calculated to, or has the effect of inducing submission by actual or threatened adverse consequences. Thirdly, it says that it is related to one or more grounds in respect of which discrimination is prohibited in terms of Section 6.1 of the Employment Equity Act. So you can see that it really speaks about a broad range of actions that actually can constitute as harassment. You know, Sharon mentioned that it might include like violence, physical abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, you know, gender-based abuse, as well as racial abuse. But it goes on to also define what sexual harassment is particularly. And it says that sexual harassment of an employee is a form of unfair discrimination. I like to just underline that word, unfair discrimination, and is prohibited on grounds of sex, gender, and sexual orientation. Please keep that in mind, gender, sex, and sexual orientation, because many a times, particularly when you look at the umbrella of gender-based violence, it's mainly a male versus female type of situation. You know, mostly females are the victims of this, but what we're seeing from this definition is that we can see same-sex gender-based violence, and we can actually see the flip of it, the inverse of it, which is something that to really take into account. Now, how do we actually test? There's a test in which the code brings in as to how do we define a particular conduct as whether does that amount to discrimination. And I think maybe people can just keep this in mind. It's a 4-tier test. These are the 4 things that we ask. Firstly, we ask whether the harassment is on a prohibited ground of sex, gender, or sexual orientation. So we look at that to say, is this particular act from one person to another as a result of any of these prohibited grounds? So is it an act based on, I'm acting against you because you are female and I'm male. I'm acting against you because you might affiliate to one of the LGBTQI communities and I might hold a contrary view. Secondly, it says it is sexual conduct which is unwelcomed. Look at that word, unwelcomed. By the fact that it says unwelcomed, it brings a subjective element, which I really like to bring in here. Because what I might think you perceive as welcomed might actually be the contrary view. For example, I might say, oh, wow, I actually like your lips. You might feel that that is a very unwelcomed statement. And that's something to really take into account, that it has a very subjective element, which many times people tend to kind of rule out, to say that might not have been the intention, but the person receiving that particular act might feel that that is unwelcomed. Thirdly, it says that the nature and the extent of the sexual conduct, that we look at the nature and extent of the sexual conduct of the conduct per se, and then we look at the impact of the sexual conduct on the particular employee. So these 4 things are ones that we take into account when we really look at this. You know, that is the broader spectrum of particularly harassment, sexual harassment. And when we look at, for example, the conduct of rape, this is basically when one forces another person to have sexual intercourse. And when we look at sexual assault, we have when one basically violates another person without consent. Another big word in law, you know, that consent element. You guys also see it a lot with patient care and so forth. So those are different definitions of sexual harassment in the bigger vacuum, as well as a sexual assault and rape. Thank you.
So thank you. That was very, very comprehensive. I think for me, the words that stand out to me as number 1, dignity, is how these kinds of actions steal from someone's dignity. It takes away from your dignity, it takes away from yourself, your sense of self, you know, your sense of belonging to this team, your sense of how you do your work or how you conduct yourself, but also even what you said about unwelcome, right? And I think that sometimes touch on this, is that at times when you are maybe the recipient of these unwelcomed let's say, actions or words, for example, you kind of underplay it and you say, oh, perhaps maybe I hyped it up, or, maybe in some instances, right? But I think what I appreciate is that perhaps if as a female, I feel that, this is unwelcomed, this is not attention that I'd asked for or that I appreciate, it's not welcome to me, that perhaps that is sufficient to say, no, this is not okay. Because I think sometimes even, and maybe this might be in certain institutions, maybe our tolerance has become high, because I know where I used to work some years ago, it's that you would take, you tolerate this, okay, they would say something, but okay, if they spoke to you in a certain way, if they called you, I mean, I'll just put it out there, if they called you sexy in an award round and this was your HOD, that was fine. But as long as he doesn't touch me. And other places are, okay, no, but they can touch you, but as long as they don't do this, and I think that it's so nice to have these clear definitions so that we can all say no, right? And these things, I think, similar to what Prof. Ndlovu says, that regarding the academic bullying, where there are posters, there's information around. I think that some of our workplaces perhaps needs to put more work to say that this is actually harassment, guys. Like, maybe where you grew up, like this was normal. Maybe in your society, but in the workplace, this constitutes as harassment and this carries consequences. So thank you for giving us some definitions that we can all look at and think on and, reflect on. But I also think that Prof. Ndlovu says something very interesting in terms of, well, two things. One is to be able to be aware that it happens to males, right? So we can't leave them behind. And I think that it also speaks to something in our society that says, now there's more confidence of women to speak up and to speak against this, but are we doing enough for our brothers to make them feel safe enough to also speak up when this is happening, one? But also number two, which is important for Prof. Ndlovu, is also to be aware of, the said perpetrator, to make sure that within, I guess, this space, that the issue is managed fairly in such a way that neither the victim, or let's call her the survivor, him or her the survivor, or also the person who is allegedly the perpetrator, is not discriminated towards until, there is either a final outcome or final ruling or something. But I think I'm saying enough, and I'm not a panelist. I want to move on to Dr. Manyoni. Another question for you, Doc. So you serve on Women's Wing. What do you think is the role of our committee in terms of addressing issues of gender-based violence, and what can we do to support men and women who are facing this?
Thank you for the question, Sharon. I think our role as the Women's Wing is to, number one, bring back an importance, and I think you alluded to this, that often the lines are blurred, and it's great for us to have definitions, as Reginald gave us. We need to bring back the importance and stop trivializing things that we experience within the workplace. And that is one of our roles as the Women's Wing within the healthcare sector specifically. We know that according to, I just want to get it right, the National Crime Prevention Strategy of '96, that crimes against women and children was made a national priority. And we need to not forget that it is still a national priority today. We know the WHO SDG goal number 5 is gender equality. And I think this is where we can bring men and women in, because like Reginald touched on, there's been new definitions about gender, sexual orientation, and such definitions. So we also need to bring in, the topic of behaviors that are transphobic and homophobic within the workplace. And I think as a whole, as an organization, not just the Women's Wing, we want to expose our members, and even those that are not yet our members, to the support structures within the organizations that are already there. Because, once you are in an incident, like, you experience a gender-based violence offense, it can be quite challenging because you don't know where to go, what to do. And maybe all you need is information. And I think we are there to even provide the information. And should you need the social support or the legal the legal support, we are there to do that. And I think lastly, just to unblur the factors in the healthcare sector specifically that increase the risk of GBV incidences happening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Khal. Thank you. I think I really like, so for the longest time, I felt that a lot of women don't have a place to go, barring, let's say, your senior, for example. And sometimes your senior might not be a safe person, or for whatever reason, you might not be comfortable. But I think the advantage of the women's wing is it gives you, let's say, an objective group or an objective support where these people are not directly associated with your workplace, associated with, I don't know, your bosses, and it can just be people who are there to give you advice and guide you in terms of the way forward. So back to Prof, how perhaps can training programs be improved to better address issues of maybe gender-based violence? Do you believe that there are ways that we can improve it, or is what we're doing sufficient at the moment?
Muted, okay. Yeah, thank you, Sharon, for your question. I think in the workplace, it's important that we create a culture of care and concern, and a culture that is psychologically safe, where people are encouraged to raise issues and concerns. And we also need to establish and create ongoing opportunities to raise awareness, educate, and also try and discuss difficult topics such as these, as gender-based violence. I think additionally, it would be important to encourage faculty and staff members to access, available training opportunities to ensure they are also prepared to receive workplace disclosures and handle them in a manner that is comforting, compassionate, and shows empathy, and also make these resources available, for example, on sexual violence, domestic abuse, and psychological safety. So I would say, that's the kind of ambience or culture that we need to make sure prevails at all our institutions. Again, have posters everywhere showing, and I think Mr. Masimula explained nicely that we need to understand what is sexual harassment, what is gender-based violence, because as I mentioned, we need to be fair, we need to protect all people, the males, the female, LGBTQ, because they also get a lot of slack, sometimes because of the gender diversity. So, and critically analyze the situation with a non-biased approach so that we can also protect our males as well, because sometimes, as I mentioned in the situation in the medical school, that there was a scenario like that where the problem was actually not with the perpetrator, but with, the female, yeah.
Thank you, Prof. I think that it's so important to see an institution where they're also looking at how leaders can handle it if they experience such a case. Because sometimes you'll find that when a case is reported, or the person you reported it to is also like, they don't know what to do. They don't know what the next steps are. And perhaps maybe just to follow up, within your institution, do you guys have any specific steps in terms of how to report it, should it happen?
Yeah, and I think the one thing we did also, I think 2 years ago, we had, well, it was again focused on academic bullying. We had webinars, like I mentioned. So those are important platforms that are easy to access where, these topics can be dealt with by experts. And of course, I don't claim, as a disclaimer, I'm not an expert in gender-based violence. I resisted this invitation, but I had to come. So I'm merely sharing my my personal experience, but I am nowhere an expert in this topic, yeah. But in terms of reporting, I think, we are all responsible for that. and one has to follow the processes that are in line in terms of their institution. That is, for example, responding to a disclosure of sexual violence process and contact the relevant faculty relations or human resources, or it could be health and safety and environmental HR in certain institutions for guidance, in terms of disclosure that involves faculty or staff. And one has to seek guidance and act, while maintaining confidentiality, because it's a very sensitive issue. So confidentiality is very crucial. And I think if one is unable to reach out to the formal official reporting guidelines, speaking to a friend who can help them, to learn about the complaint and the process, as well as ask for assistance to a friend or a colleague if they find it difficult to report this themselves. And of course, ensuring that the survivor's wishes, the person has been abused or harassed, their confidentiality is maintained and their wishes are also maintained.
No, thank you. I think that's important, Prof. And I know that you touched on this previously, but I really liked what you said about the importance of having the uncountable discussions. I think like the discussion we're having now is that in my years in my own department, it's not something that we've ever spoken about just as a department, but perhaps maybe as registrars, there'll be whispers here and there about, oh, this happened, oh, this. But, when something is, I don't know, this is my thinking, sometimes when something is brought to the front, it has less power, than something that is said in secret. And if everyone is aware of this topic and is free about discussing it, I think that, people, they're less likely to be misunderstandings about either the definition. So even the perpetrator, let them do it knowingly, but okay, you know that you're crossing the line, that there will be consequences. Let no one be shocked about these actions. So thank you, I think, and I'm hoping that this will be the beginning of many more conversations and talks about these, these awkward and kind of topics.
Yeah,
so,
I always say, Sharon, with everything, whether you're talking about gender-based violence, you're talking about academic bullying, we're talking about racism, we're talking about favoritism, I always say we need to get comfortable talking about uncomfortable issues. We need to get comfortable talking about uncomfortable issues, because it's only when we start deliberating and chatting about these, then we can open up and we can hear, each other's point of views and listen to how they see things, because there's all these cultural differences and a whole lot of dimensions to these issues. So I think having these webinars, this is a great thing that you've started, and it's a great initiative.
Thank you, Prof. And thank you for coming, even though you resisted initially. Dr. Manyoni, back to you. What, in your opinion, are some of the greater implications in society of GBV in the healthcare system?
Okay, I like how you slid in your opinion. So my opinion is not representative of SAMA as a whole. No. But we do know that there is a great impact on the individual, and we can't underscore it enough, because I can imagine the physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual effects that an individual that has experienced a sexual offense goes through. But the indirect consequences we can look at from different perspectives. In my opinion, there are economic consequences that we can't, shy away from, because, when something like this happens, you could have decrease in productivity of your workforce, either through absenteeism or presenteeism. I mean, I can imagine how hard it is to be at work with the perpetrator, every day, just continuing, like, while policies and frameworks are, trying to progress. But it can be a challenge to be in the workplace. So we do have that economic effect. And also that plays to our patient care. Patient care is hindered because of maybe staff shortages, someone is not at work, whatever it could be. But I also think that, if there's a perpetrator who can commit an offense to a colleague, that they are also a risk to patients. And, we also have a duty to report, our colleagues that are not behaving in the right sense at work because we're trying to protect patients. I mean, for example, in a gynecological department, would you feel safe to just, for life to continue as it were? And I think finally, my last consequence would be a more philosophical. I'd say families are at the brunt of these consequences. And I think if we as a generation fail to have these uncomfortable conversations, like we are saying, then we just perpetuate it to the next generation and we make it their problem. Now they must start the uncomfortable conversations when we either didn't do it justice. And I think that is a consequence that we cannot overlook, because we can also perpetuate some of these offenses into the next generation. Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you. I think you mentioned a very important topic, and in terms of just the economic impact, yes, I think people like to think of it as, it only affects maybe one gender, or, like that it's limited to the impact on the individual and the perpetrator, but it has a greater impact in society, as you said, in terms of one, economically, but also in terms of, I think for me, I think even within the medical fraternity, there's still certain specialties where you find predominantly more males. And I find that where you have, where you have specialties like that, you lose the opportunity of diversity. So let's say we know the most popular one is orthopedics, where most orthopods are male. We still have very little females, and props to them. I know that they've started a female orthopedic society show, so shout out to them. And I think that's important, because should I break my leg, I actually, look, I don't want to speak too much, but I want to speak to a female who understands that, okay, I need this because I must still change, let's say, a pad, or I need my hands to undo my bra, for example, where I might either be uncomfortable to speak to with a man, or a man may not think of that as an issue. And so it's important to be aware that, yes, we want representation, but we don't just want representation for the sake of representation. But I think studies have shown that having diverse groups improves patient outcomes. It improves patient care. So it's within the best interest of the different fraternities to have different genders, different races, different ages, because it speaks to, the whole society. Mr. Masemola, going back to you, I wanted to find out what legal protections exist against gender-based violence in the workplace, and how can, let me just, before we get, and how can the survivors be, I guess, protected within the workplace against the perpetrators?
Okay. I think, I just want to tie it in with some of the comments that were made. In as much as we are unpacking this conversation and we're talking about victims and we're talking about consequences, in order for us to really uproot this issue, we need to maybe take it a step back and look at the perpetrators. Because, if we don't have a perpetrator, we won't have a victim. And say, maybe that is where this conversation actually needs to start, where people are conscientized of certain behaviors that constitute or really result in the consequence of us now having victims. Societal constructs, for example, is a typical one. Let me give you an example. If you grow up in a township setting, it's very common for guys to sit on a corner and just catch up on the day as the sun sets. During that time, people are coming back from work. You see a beautiful lady, she walks by, guys will either comment, they will either whistle. That's something that becomes a norm. Even when you are in these settings, you normalize that kind of behavior, and it doesn't become a thing. Now you carry that into the workplace and you are doing your rounds and somebody whistles and says a comment like that, hey, you look sexy today. Because of that societal background and where you come from and that base that you have, that's something which you have normalized as good conduct or as a oh, it's a by the way type of conversation. And maybe we need to start having those conversations to say, let's start breaking these walls down and say, let's normalize what is unwanted behavior. In terms of the workspace and what protection exists, I mean, we can really start it right at the top and look at our constitution. You know, the constitution is out clear. We have my favorite, which is the equality clause, which says one will not discriminate based on gender, sex. You know, it has all of these grounds written there. You know, we also have now in section 23, for example, of the constitution, which says everyone has the right to fair labor practices. That on its own tells you that the law seeks to create an environment for everybody to feel safe in, an environment in which everybody gets an opportunity to express themselves in whichever way they feel that they can be themselves, well within the confines, once again, of policy. When we look at, once again, creating policy, do I really necessarily think that people are not protected in terms of policy? I don't think so. People really are protected. We've got great policies in workspaces because we've got compliance officers and so forth. But the question then comes in that enforcement of that policy. It's the same thing with law. Are we enforcing the law enough? Are people being educated about their rights enough? Are we doing enough in our workspaces to train our colleagues in terms of the policies that we have in place to answer or to address some of these issues? And many of the times you find when you start a new job, for example, you will go through training with HR and they'll make you read some documents, and part of them would be the policy and they'll make you sign. And how many of us actually remember those policies if we don't have these refresher trainings that are done annually? And those that do have these refresher trainings, how many do we talk amongst ourselves and say, oh, what a waste of time, must we go through this every year? Not being aware that what this does is that remember, you don't just pick up a habit or pick up information just like that overnight. It's something that needs to really be in us, instilled in us. And we all know practice makes perfect, or the more you go through something, the more you'll actually become comfortable with it, the more you'll recognize it, the more you'll become familiar with it. And more you'll actually understand that actually whistling is actually not something that is allowed. Calling somebody sex is not something that is allowed. Being aware that something that I, as Reginald, might perceive as unoffensive might be offensive to you, Sharon. So those are the kind of things that we really need to understand. And our legal framework is very clear, and I really, really would like to commend it. We've got great legislation in place. You know, Employment Equity Act, basic conditions of employment. It really protects people and creates really safe work environments for us. It really does create a conducive environment. But however, it is that enforcement part where we struggle with, either because of the power dynamics, either people are not necessarily taking this seriously enough, or people are just maybe downplaying a certain act to say, if you come up to your boss and say, I didn't like the fact that Reginald whistled, it's like, man, come on, just relax. It's just a whistle. You know what I mean? We tend to downplay those acts. And maybe that is where we need to maybe start the conversation. I'm not sure if I answered your question and just added other points as well.
You answered beautifully, Reginald. And I think, especially when you talk on this issue of it being downplayed, and I don't know if it's maybe lack of expertise or confidence from the person that the issue is reported to, or I don't know, but for whatever reason, I think there's nothing as disappointing, I guess, as when a perpetrator does speak up and then they're told, oh, you know, maybe you misinterpreted it. Or a perpetrator does speak up and then they say, okay, yes, but you know, it's just 3 more months, just, you know, persevere, essentially. And I think, as you said, so I know that certain companies even have things where they have videos about cybersecurity, for example, and things like that. And I think that it's high time that within the medical fraternity, we have these constant reminders and these constant, even as you said, refreshers, as painful as they may be, about things like what is gender-based violence. You know, even within the we have CPD points, we have ethics points, but really, you know, what do these ethic points address? As people, registrars who are coming up, they're starting to introduce the work-based assessment, but perhaps part of our work should be looking at championing that some of the issues that we feel, let me speak as a woman, should be addressed, should be part of these work-based assessment, like either every 6 months or once a year. We make sure that you understand these important definitions. You make sure that you understand these consequences. And I think that it's very important that we just need a few people to have undergone the consequence, like let the consequence happen, let it occur. If someone loses a job, loses their livelihood, for people to realize that this is real, and it isn't something that should be taken for granted or taken lightly, by no means, because it significantly affects the individual who has suffered and who has had to, undergo this. And I think, as you said, one of the biggest issues, I think I touched on this in the beginning, is our society. Is because I think that our medical fraternity, it imitates, or it's just everyone loves saying microcosm. So it's a microcosm of the greater society, right? And it's things that are accepted. For example, if my husband accepts me to cook in the evenings, or expects me to look after kids. Even my boss is panicking if I start a new job and I have a child, because he feels, this one will have to leave at 4 o'clock because of this. So what parts, and if it's taking too long for us to wait for our society to change, I think we need to be very much intentional about changing our own medical fraternity as individuals, even if it's as registrars while we're still in registrar posts, and as we become specialists and as we become deans. So we change the societies where we're at while we're waiting for society to catch up. Yes, Reginald, go on. And sorry, to the other panelists, if at any point you'd like to speak, I'm watching, so you can just raise your hand. Yes?
You touched on a concept that I maybe just want to communicate. It's called the quid pro quo harassment, So its definition is, this occurs when the owner, employer, supervisor, member of management, or co-employees undertakes or attempts to influence the process of employment, promotion, training, discipline, dismissal, salary increases, or other benefits of an employee or job applicant in exchange for either sexual favors. So I just the reason why I'm bringing this up is that even when you have a victim wanting to speak up, particularly the perpetrator could be somebody or their direct manager, for example, or somebody they report to, it's very difficult to sometimes speak up because of that concept of societal backgrounds. I might be coming from an impoverished family and I had to work my way up as a doctor, and here I am today, I'm in this space, but now I'm confronted with this. I can't speak up because I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job. I can't speak up because there's a promotion that I might be looking towards. I can't speak up because I'm a registrar and I'm trying to get into speciality, and somebody who's a perpetrator is somebody in power who has the power to influence that move. That's something that we really need to speak up about, and really need to ensure that also, once we are also creating our policies are designed in such a way that caters for that kind of situation. Because many a times it says, if you have a situation, speak to your direct manager, speak to your supervisor. But what happens when the perpetrator is that person? Many a times we then say, just take it to the higher management. But then when you look at the higher management, they could be friends, they could be buddies, there could be other forms of relations within them that makes it also very difficult for you to also speak up to senior management. Policy needs to cater for those kind of situations. And that's something that is very important, that we really need to start having those conversations with our HR, with our workspaces, to say, in such a situation, what do I do? And once again, after the process has happened, maybe an investigation or whatnot, let's just say, I think Prof mentioned in that situation where the gentleman was not found to have been guilty of sexual harassment. Let's say it was a supervisor and a junior, and it's fine that the junior laid a complaint or lodged an alleged harassment, and then it said that there's no harassment. What is the relationship afterwards? What are the consequences that come afterwards? Because that's a relationship that could have just gone down the drain. Now you have to work in this hostile environment that has been created because you said you are uncomfortable about X, Y, and Z. Now you are missing out on promotions, which you are well entitled to, either based on experience, based on qualifications, but now you're overlooked because 2 years ago, 3 months ago, you actually reported an act of harassment. That's something and another conversation for us to consider.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is very important. And I think what you're mentioning is that there's still a gap within our policy that doesn't cater for that. And if we take it down to medicine, let's say, for example, you are a registrar in, let's say, ENT or ophthalmology in a small institution. And within this institution, you only have one or two consultants. Let's say, God forbid, only one consultant, right? I know that I'm exaggerating, but if that one consultant is the perpetrator, what happens to your career? Because number one, it's hard to get registrar posts, number one. Number two, even harder for you to get a reg post in ENT. Now the one person that was supposed to prepare you is causing you harm. Do you begazela? Do you persevere because okay, it's finite, it will be 3 years? Or do you leave and then, okay, you decide maybe you want to be a GP? Or I think what is so sad is that it has such career, I think currently possibly even career limiting implications if you speak out, because where do you go? And I think for me, perhaps this speaks to an opportunity for SAMA to maybe act as an intermediary, because yes, in SAMA we have access to a whole lot of specialists, and SAMA we have access to the departments of health. And so what I am hoping is we begin to have conversations that come out of this that say, if a registrar in obs and gynae goes through this, and for example, the person is found guilty, then we have enough, I don't know, strength to say, okay, can we speak to can we speak to another division for transfer? How does a transfer work? Can she go to another province? And we actually have someone speaking on behalf of this gentleman or this female, so that the decision to speak up shouldn't be a decision between my own livelihood versus speaking up and standing up for my own rights. And I think currently that's where a lot of men and women are at, especially when you are in I'll call this a vulnerable position. And some of the vulnerable positions would be things like an internship, in ComServe, in reg time as well. But even as the prof alluded to, is even this academic bullying. And I think it's frustrating because so many times in medicine, there are all these hierarchical plays, all these power plays, all these people that you still, you don't want to step on the wrong toes, but how can we as SAMA assist to make sure that if I'm stepping on the wrong toe, I'm not stepping alone, it's not Sharon stepping on and fighting alone, but can someone support me in terms of making sure that after I've stepped on this toe, I can land, after I step on this toe, I don't go hungry, for example. And I think we need that kind of support, but it firstly starts with us having those conversations, because what is frustrating is a lot of, if it's a manager or people are shocked to say, how, Kanti, that was harassment. How, Kanti, she was offended or he was offended. Yes, let's have these conversations. Let everybody know and be clear about this is harassment. This is not okay. These are the consequences, and we begin to act on these consequences. I would like to, oh gosh, the time. If the panelists don't have anything to add right now, I would like to go on to the questions and answers. Okay, so let me go on to questions. The first question said, I heard the speaker talk about looking at the impact of sexual harassment. This is very difficult to measure the psychological impact of harassment, 100%. As a facilitator is saying, we have been desensitized, and if there's no physical evidence, it deters many people from disclosing violence, particularly within the workplace. How do we keep people psychologically safe to disclose the experience of violence? Sure, this is hectic. My panelists, any ideas on how we keep people safe, or how we create an environment that is safe for people to disclose? But maybe I'll just touch on Reginald to say, is the onus only on the perpetrator? Sorry, is the onus only on the victim to find the evidence, or can the institution also assist in getting this evidence?
Well, the first or a primary basis that we have in law is that he who alleges must prove, right? That's basically where we start off. But we need to also then look at the nature of the offense, or the nature of what it is that we're trying to prove. it goes out to say that the victim, unfortunately, would need to present a case. And when we say present a case, it's just basically relaying what has happened, that this event occurred, and this is what happened, and this is how I felt. Unfortunately, we can't expect other people to do that for us, but primarily it lies on us. The responsibility also then goes on to the employer to consult both parties to ensure that a proper investigation gets done, and to ensure that all bases are looked at when we are dealing with these cases. But that is it. Who alleges needs to prove. But at the very same time, we need to be very cognizant and make sure that we've got the necessary support and people are also supported in these instances. Like Prof mentioned, there's a huge element of confidentiality that needs to also be upheld. That because I have now laid a complaint, I can't now go around the company or going around the workspace or going around the wards now asking people for statements, asking people for confirmatory affidavits or anything of the effect. That needs to be done, but it's the onus is on the employer to ensure that a proper investigation does occur, where it occurs in camera, in private, in closed rooms, private meetings are called in, a committee is formed of some sort that has various and independent views that can basically review the merits of the case, needs to also be called in. Once again, it could be a situation where I might perceive a certain piece of information in a particular way, but when we have a bigger scheme of a bigger group, like a committee of some sort, reviewing and hearing these matters, it makes it much more easier because you don't have just a male perspective listening to the evidence, or you don't just have a female perspective listening to the evidence. Because it's very easy for gender-based violence. Once a female says, "I don't like the fact that you whistled at me," as a female employer or somebody in authority, it's very easy for me to also recognize that because I might have also been a victim of that. Whereas a male might just maybe easily turn it down. So once you just have that group of people that can maybe review this evidence, it makes it easier, it brings in more objective views, and I think it makes the process much more easier, and it's much more easy to contain it that way.
Thank you, Mr. Masamula. Dr. Manyoni, I see your hand is up.
Yes, I just wanted to add to what Reginald was saying, and also in response to the question. And I think creating an environment of psychological safety is a very difficult question to answer, number one. And I think ultimately what we would have to look at is creating or changing the culture that is already within the healthcare sector. And I think it's also a societal culture. So it's not a thing that can happen instantaneously, but I think it will take time because change management is a difficult thing within itself, especially when it involves people. And one of the things that Reginald mentioned was about the confidential reporting. And I think it's very important that we advocate for reporting to happen, because that is how we red flag individuals, if I will say, and they undergo investigations and whatever the outcome may be. But you would find that an individual who is, for instance, a perpetrator is not a first-time perpetrator, that often perpetrators repeatedly offend as they go along. And if we do not report, then we sort of let them and we sort of accept, this is just the way that so-and-so is. He just does this all the time. It's okay, let it slide. And that is how we perpetuate the culture that is already ongoing. So I think, we do need to accept that it's not going to be an overnight change. Unfortunately, people will be exposed to environments where they still feel like they're not completely psychologically safe, and we acknowledge that weakness within our frameworks. But I think as individuals we should try and do our parts in reporting, and hopefully our leadership can also come to the party as well.
Thank you, Dr. Manyoni. I think what we are speaking to a little bit is just that this points out a gap in our policies in terms of looking after the psychological impact of the person who reports. I'll go on to the next comment. It says, "Thank you for this topic. It has prompted me to reflect on how we sometimes overlook or downplay harassment directed towards men as well, and how often this all affects both females and males in the workplace or society." I think certainly both sexes are affected, definitely. Our next comment states, medicine in particular has high rates of sexual harassment in international literature. The nature of the one-on-one training lends itself to increased vulnerability, yes. Women are unlikely to report sexual harassment because of secondary victimization. Senior leaders that may be perpetrators are often protected by the institution. They are spared because of the position and seniority and stature. Harassment must be seen in the context of a patriarchal society. Yes, I think, as we alluded to before, is that what we're seeing in medicine is a play on what we see in the greater society. And if we keep waiting for society to change, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice, but we need to begin to change our own medical fraternity first. And then one of our last ones says, our policies are adequate. The issue is that senior members and teams band together and protect the perpetrator. Okay, I'm not sure, but okay. They have a long-standing relationship with the perpetrator, or he or she is a valuable member of the team. Nothing will be done. Oh, yeah. The perpetrator is in a space of power and a victim is actively encouraged not to disclose their trauma. Also, we need to discuss how these perpetrators begin with grooming, and not enough is spoken about that. I think Dr. Rapport, the person who made this comment, speaks about something very important, and this is the fact that maybe because it's allowed in society, it's supported and it's protected, the perpetrator is protected within the medical fraternity. But perhaps the important thing for us, what we can do is, as Prof. Flova said, is we need to start having more of these conversations, more be comfortable in having these uncomfortable conversations. And I think then it makes it very, very difficult for people to continue to get away with this. But I think certainly there definitely are places where people are getting away with it. And also perhaps there are places where they are not. But unfortunately, I think where we are, it still stands that more people are getting away with it than facing the consequences. We have another comment. My experience at a South African university with a clear anti-sexual, anti-GBV or gender bullying policy is that joint appointees are caught between two legal regimes, province and the university. So when complaints are made, each of these employers often defers to the other one so that the complainant is left stuck in the middle. As well, the outcome of legal processes often supersedes internal disciplinary misconduct interventions. What is the solution? Mr. Masumula, I don't know if you can assist us with this one. I'll just repeat it. She says that when complaints are made, each of these employers, they defer to each other, and the outcome of the legal process often supersedes the internal disciplinary intervention. Is there a solution for this? Or do we still need more work?
Well, I think it's two-sided. Before we even take this issue outside, it starts internally. And that it is very important that we strengthen the internal processes before we even try and jump it outside, not taking the outside legal framework for granted. But this is something that is very important that is happening in this country. When this country declared having 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, it really brought into account the seriousness of this issue, and that it is very important that from an internal point of view, we've got good frameworks that are able to deal with this issue at root cause level and not necessarily rely on external factors such as reporting it to the police or taking on a criminal case so that this issue gets sorted out. It starts within each and every organization to ensure that women and children of vulnerable communities are protected, to ensure that men and women have good, safe spaces for them to be able to work in. It starts there. Who's responsible for these spaces? It's our employers and our employees. It's our employers, sorry for that. They've got clear responsibilities of ensuring that they've got good policies that can ensure that such issues are able to be addressed at proper root cause levels internally before we can even rely on the external framework. And the legal system is a very lengthy process. We all know this. The legal process is one that involves money, that involves other people and other personnel. The minute you go and report a case, for example, and SAPS gets involved, we all know how that turns out. We all know about the delays that comes with that, So that on its own brings certain obstacles that unfortunately we need to take into account and we need to fix. We're waiting for great change now that we've gone through, a new leadership. But these are the issues that we need to be cognizant of, because not all the time can somebody just go to a SAPS, report a case, and 2 months down the line, the perpetrator is behind bars. Unfortunately, our legal system doesn't work like that, or it's not that advanced. But I don't think that all hope is lost. I really, as somebody who is a custodian of this law, I really do feel that we have a good system. There is a lot of work that needs to be done, absolutely, yes. And it's very important that from an internal point of view, we really understand the seriousness of this issue. And once we're able to attend to it on that level, on an internal basis, on me going to work, once I'm safe at work, it makes it so much easier if I want to take it outside, for example, and have a criminal case reported. Because the minute they need to get evidence, they will come to my workplace, and guess what? They'll find an employer that has a good report, that has a good file as to exactly what happened, and at times good evidence. And the minute I've got good evidence, then we can then call upon justice to come forward.
Thank you. I think lastly, we have a question that states, how do we handle a situation, or how does one handle a situation where the actual perpetrator is the patient and the victim now is the doctor? And in this case, they stated that upon reporting with tangible evidence to the supervisor, nothing is done. But I mean, quickly, what are the steps when the perpetrator is the person you're supposed to serve, the patient?
Well, I think now you've got an interplay of doctor-patient confidentiality, which most perhaps the patient is probably relying on to say whatever happened in that consultation room will stay between us. But however, the law is also very clear that there are certain exceptions, and this is clearly one of them. There are certain grounds in which doctor-patient confidentiality can be broken. And in that particular case, it's exactly that. You can report it to your supervisors. Should you feel that that is not enough, you can actually open a criminal case against that particular patient, and of which what happened or your notes in that consultation room will then form part of the evidence that you will bring forward in order to push on this matter. So we shouldn't necessarily hide behind these vacuums or feel that there is no escape for us in those particular situations. As practitioners, you do have rights. Your rights, and as much as patients have rights, so do you. And one of those rights is that you need to feel safe in a consultation. So yeah, so we can really break it, and there are avenues for you to explore.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Colleagues, we have definitely exceeded our time this evening. I think maybe in this order, I'll let Dr. Manyoni just say something quickly, Mr. Masemola say something quickly, and then Prof. Clover, you can say something quickly, just your parting remarks to the audience, and I'll close us off after that. Dr. Manyoni?
Thank you, Sharon. I think my closing remarks would be that, there is help, there is support. One of the great objectives of the Women's Wing is actually this particular issue. So, we are available to answer questions, to assist, to guide, and you can get in touch with Sama, to get in touch with the Women's Wing, and we will do what we can to assist you in this regard. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Manyoni. Mr. Masemola?
Gender-based violence is a very critical issue that we all need to really pay close attention to and give it the necessary focus. It's very important that in doing this, that all of us are educated about the subject, all of us are aware of the consequences and the root causes of this. Once again, the South African Medical Association, in particular the legal department, is here to offer that kind of support. Many practitioners go through the workspace not having the necessary legal support and not understanding their rights. As the legal department, we are here to support you. We are here to journey with you through those complexities. We're here to inform you and train you on some of the aspects that we feel that you might not have the necessary information, particularly legally speaking. So we really, once again, say, this is not something that as SAMA we take very lightly. We really stand behind everyone. We stand behind you as practitioners to ensure that you have great environments, that you feel protected. Once again, our mission is to ensure that we have a great workspace for the greater good of the nation, but that can only happen once everybody feels safe, and particularly women. It's important that you, as the forefront of this country, feel very safe in the environment, and it's up to us to ensure that we create that spaces. Once again, this is not an issue just against women, but for both and for everybody to take into cognizance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reginald. Prof. Clover?
Thank you so much, colleagues. I really learned so much from each and every one of you. And thank you, Sharon, for conducting this interview in such an elegant and eloquent manner. And thank you to my co-panelists. I've really learned a lot from you as well. So I just want to say, yeah, we have to report it when it happens. I know it's uncomfortable. It's a painful experience. It's very sometimes demeaning, and sometimes women may feel they called this upon themselves. You shouldn't think like that. And we need to report it as soon as it happens, because by reporting it, we're preventing the perpetrator from going on, because they also bank on the fact that we are so embarrassed to talk about these issues, and therefore it's almost like pedophiliacs, it just happens and carries on like that. So we have to report it. And again, to Mr. Masimula's point that this is not only for women, there are men also who are on the victim side of the coin. So we need to think about them as well, although predominantly it's women who are affected. And also want to say, I think as leaders and faculty and staff, we have a responsibility really to act once we're made aware of any workplace violence and follow it up, because as Mr. Masumela said, it could be a protracted process, but we have to keep on, pushing until we get to the bottom of the problem.
Thank you so much, Prof. Colleagues, thank you for engaging with us and for being part of this very important conversation. I hope that this will be the start of having a lot of more uncomfortable conversations. I know that we've only just touched the tip of the iceberg with this. There's so many more aspects to delve into, but I hope that at least this is the beginning, and we're having more conversations in our corridors and possibly in our ward rounds or in our own work meetings. But let's begin to talk about this and other comfortable things and shed light on this. So everyone, thank you so much. I'd like to thank the Summer Head Office for putting this together and for organizing this. A special shout out to Monique, a special shout out to Zianda from Head Office. We are grateful for this opportunity, and thank you for organizing all of this, and the summer leadership. Thank you for giving us this platform to discuss matters that are important and that impact on all medical doctors. Colleagues, have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, panelists.